You're listening to episode 96 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Tim Gard speaks with us about a new study just released on pain attenuation through mindfulness. Hi, everyone. As we mentioned in last week's episode, we're fortunate this week in having the author of a new study just released. This study helps shed some light on what happens in the brain when we feel pain, what happens in the brain when we feel pain while in a mindfulness state, and how this is different than what we see in placebo responses to pain. We also examine some of the subtle differences between studies of this kind and why these distinctions matter. Again, I would like to thank the staff of Dr. Sarah Lazar's lab at Massachusetts General Hospital for their outreach and interest in timely discussion of their work. What you're discovering is helping energize and excite us, and we're truly grateful to you. Tim Gard is a PhD student of neuroscience at the Bender Institute of Neuroimaging in Gießen, Germany, where he is currently finishing up his thesis on the neural correlates of mindfulness-induced analgesia. He obtained his master's degree in psychology from Maastricht University with his thesis entitled Regulation of Emotion and Cognition During Mathematical Problem Solving, The Effects of Yoga in an Indian Sample. Currently, Tim is a visiting researcher and research assistant at the Lazar Lab at Massachusetts General Hospital, where he works on behavioral and neuroimaging data. After his graduation, Tim will continue to investigate yoga as a postdoctoral fellow in Dr. Lazar's lab. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice Coke. Lots of ice. It actually goes quite well in winter. And my guest today is Tim Gard from Massachusetts General Hospital. Tim, thanks for being here.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I'm very glad to have you. What I'd like to do is ask you a little bit about what your background is before we get into the study that you recently did. Tell us about your first encounters with meditation and how that ties in with your career in science.
Oh, actually, that's a really good question because I think my interest in meditation and yoga and my scientific path are pretty much intertwined. So my first exposure to yoga was right after high school, and the experiences that I had with yoga were kind of transformative and made me curious about how perspectives on things can change by just doing some simple practices. And actually, I would even go as far and say that these experiences influenced my choice in studying psychology. During my studies in psychology, I continued practicing yoga and took the opportunity to do, for my master's thesis, research in yoga. So I went to India and studied the effects of yoga intervention on the functioning of high school kids. That was the first point where I really did some science on yoga.
Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about that. What kind of practice did they do? As a basic, I presume, a very basic yoga practice, but what did you find from that study? What exactly did you do?
So the high school kids basically, so we introduced a yoga course there, and that was based on classical yoga as written up by Patanjali, basically, as by Patanjali, um, meaning it included pranayams and asanas, and there was also attention for ethical components actually. And we had a control condition. Uh, so we had two classes available, and the individuals of the classes got randomly assigned to either a low impact aerobics course or to the yoga course. And then they practiced like aerobics or yoga in the mornings before schools. Actually, that was the nice part of working in India. There, the school authorities have much more power, so they tell the kids, you come 40 minutes earlier, and they will come 40 minutes earlier.
We wouldn't get away with that
Yeah.
here, no.
Yes, here you wouldn't, I guess. Um, but actually, the kids really liked it. And then we gave them before and after the intervention with a couple of test days in which we gave them pretty difficult mathematics problems, and we had them complete online emotion questionnaires that they were doing completing while they were solving the mathematics problems, so that we really could tap into how are their emotions and cognitions while they are solving problems. And we saw that the quality of the emotions was more positive after the yoga course than after the aerobics course, actually. So that was a first nice finding to see that yoga indeed had um, an effect on on the emotional experience of students in a stressful situation.
Now, from that, you ended up at the Bender Institute. Is that correct?
That's correct. So once my master's in psychology was done, and I got a little bit frustrated with all these questionnaires during my yeah during my research study with the students, I felt I want to investigate more objective measures, more biological measures. Um, And so I applied for a PhD program in neuroscience and ended up at the Bender Institute of Neuroimaging at the University of Gießen, which at that time was the only institute in Europe doing brain research about meditation and yoga. And actually, from my work there, the current paper that we're going to talk about originated. So um,
Now let's talk a little bit about that paper, as that's really what the bulk of this interview will be about. What is that particular study about? Give us the high level view of what it was this study was studying.
So basically, we were interested in how pain is differently processed during a state of mindfulness as compared to a baseline state, to a normal state, to a state um, of the daily life,
Hmm.
right? Um, and for to investigate that, we recruited very experienced meditators so that we would be sure that they would be able to um, get into this state quickly and reliably. And as a control condition, we recruited healthy subjects that were like had similar education levels, gender, and age as the meditators.
And oddly handedness. So I'm going to, as I said before we started the interview, I'd ask about that. One of the things I noticed in the paper for people who are listening to the episode is that a lot of the criteria, which was very impressive about this study, is the matching between the meditation naive control group and the experienced meditators. And what we did to make sure what I saw in here as a valid control is that they were in other ways very much a match in terms of age and health and other categories. But one thing that stood out for me was handedness. I didn't quite understand it, and as a lefty, I always raise an eyebrow when handedness enters into the picture. So, Tim, tell us a little bit about why that entered into the criteria.
So basically, there are some studies that show that the brains of left-handed persons are functioning differently than the brains of right-handed persons. And to be honest, I don't even know the details about these studies anymore. But in neuroimaging, it's a standard it's a standard criterion that you want people of the same handedness in studies.
I think it's because us lefties just throw the curve for you right-handed people. That's my story, and I'm sticking with it.
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe. So you had a good control group, and you had a set of experienced meditators. What did you do in the study itself?
So basically, we asked both the meditators and the controls to deal with mildly painful electric stimuli in different ways. So actually we had 4 conditions. We had a distraction condition, an aversion condition, and we're not going to talk about these 2 conditions here. But we also had the mindfulness condition, which was the main focus of the study, and a baseline condition. So basically, during the baseline condition, we didn't give them specific instructions, except for that we asked the meditators to not engage in meditation. And in the mindfulness conditions, we asked the participants to focus on the electrodes, the surface underneath the electrodes, where they would receive the shocks, and just be aware of what they notice there, what do they feel, and to be curious about what is happening there, and accepting and non-judging about these sensations.
And that leads to something I wanted to ask about and that you touched on, is that mindfulness was very different from other techniques that are used in pain modulation in fundamentally those 2 ways. One is the attention of the experiences in the present moment. You're not trying to shut it out or avoid it or be distracted by it. You're really experiencing it. And a non-judgmental attitude. These are very different from other attention and cognition-driven pain modulation strategies. So it's really important for people to notice that mindfulness has a fundamental difference from some of the other things that people do in these studies.
Yes, exactly. That's right. For example, one strategy to reduce pain, to modulate pain, is to direct the attention towards different stimuli, or towards different, basically to direct the attention to something else than the unpleasant stimulus.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
For example, you can focus on like music or watch a movie, and while your attention is with the music or with the movie, you will experience the pain less intense and less unpleasant probably. So that's really the attention component. Whereas in mindfulness, as the definition says, is like paying attention to the present moment. So what is going on in this moment? And if you're receiving unpleasant electric shocks, then that is what's going on in the present moment. So mm-hmm. you are there with your attention.
Right. Now, a word about the electric shocks themselves is that what I saw in the paper is that it was a fairly narrow range of electric stimuli, that there was a little bit of a baseline setting with the individuals, but it was still within a fairly narrow band for all the participants, and the pain levels would be equated to something along the lines of a sharp needle prick, something along those lines. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. So basically, before we started before we started the scanning and before the real experiment started, we set the shock level with each participant individually, such that the pain intensity would be rated around 6 out of 10. So on a 10-point scale, we asked them, let's go such high that you rate the intensity as 6. And I think what was interesting, or at least compared to a study by Joshua Grant, for example, he looked at pain tolerance in experienced meditators, and he found that Zen meditators had increased or had higher pain tolerance than control. So they needed a higher heat.
Mm-hmm.
He worked with heat stimuli. They needed a higher temperature to feel the same amount of pain as controls. This was not the case in our study. I mean, we did not work with pain stimuli. We worked with electric shocks. So it might be something of that nature, but we also had a different type of meditators. Basically, the shock levels were set individually, but there was no group difference in the stimulus charge that was necessary to produce that pain intensity of 6 out of 10.
Okay. Now, something I wanted to ask about is, and this often comes up in discussions, as it did in our interview with Sarah Lazar, one of your colleagues, is the placebo effect. And this is something that, as people who are listening to the podcast know, I'm active in the skeptical community, and we tend to use the word placebo in a very dismissive fashion. That's just the placebo effect. And we set it aside as if there's no value in it. Now, one of the things I wanted us to chat about for just a moment is that what we described as mindfulness having a couple of qualities of that attention to the experience in the present moment and the non-judgmental attitude, those two characteristics, that placebo is fundamentally different from that. Could you tell us just a little bit about the difference and why this isn't so much something we could equate with placebo?
Yes. So from a conceptual point of view, placebo includes a change of expectation, and it also includes like reappraisal components. By changing the expectations, the context of the pain is changed basically, and this change in context, this reappraisal is associated with lateral prefrontal cortex activation actually. And to stick on the conceptual level, I think mindfulness by definition is non-judging, non-appraising. So there is not an attempt to change the context of the pain. It is just what it is.
Right. It's an open inquisitiveness to the experience of the moment, whatever that may be.
Exactly. That's correct. And interestingly, to talk briefly about our imaging finding, we found decreased activation in lateral prefrontal cortex. So the region that is involved in placebo and is associated with reappraisal.
And it sounds like that would fit very nicely with here in the brain. We can point to, based on these results, that it's different areas of the brain, different things are happening when we see a placebo type of response versus what we're seeing here with the mindful attention.
Exactly, and maybe even more important, in placebo, like when pain is modulated or when pain is reduced by placebo, we see decreases or no changes in activity in pain-related areas, in sensory pain-related areas, such as primary, secondary, somatosensory cortex, thalamus, and posterior insula. And we see an increase in activation in the posterior insula. So that is also showing that mindfulness is really different than placebo.
Now, we've spoken in the past with Fadil Zidan about one of his studies on meditation as a control for pain, and he did a similar kind of study. Before we go into the results, deep into the results of what you found in your study, can you tell us a little bit about how this study that you've done is a little bit different than the others?
Okay, there are actually several dimensions on which our study is different from Fadel Zaidan's study. So one thing is the experience of the meditators. Fadel recruited meditation naive participants, and then they received meditation training. And if I remember it right, they received 4 times 20 minutes of meditation, so in total of 80 minutes of meditation. So compared to our meditators with an average of 6,000 hours of meditation experience, there is a huge difference, basically. And maybe the different results are due to that. It also could be the case that, or actually it is the case, that the instructions were different. Fadel asked the participants to focus on their breath, their respiration.
Oh, so they're doing a concentration meditation, not a mindfulness meditation.
He calls it mindfulness meditation, and I think it's difficult because in mindfulness meditation, often a first step is to first sharpen the attention by focusing on the breath.
Yeah, and
And
with early meditators, it may be a little more challenging to distinguish between whether one is doing a concentration, resting the mind in one attentive spot, versus a very open awareness of a mindfulness meditation technique.
that is correct too. And to be honest, I don't know what the exact instructions in Fadel's study were, apart from that the focus was on the breath. So by focusing on the breath, I think there might be a distraction component in it as well, like focusing on music or focusing on the movie to reduce pain. Um, so yes, the differences might be explained by different types of meditation techniques.
So what this seems to indicate is that there are benefits to a distractive kind of practice, whether that's putting your mind on the breath or on listening to music or something else, versus mindfulness, which is a full engagement with the sensation in a non-judging fashion. And that you
Mm-hmm.
were seeing different kinds of results in what was going on in the brain that, to me, that would help indicate at least a causality of mindfulness to what we're seeing in the scans. Does that make sense?
It kind of makes sense. The thing is, it is so Fadel had this attention manipulation, and we had the attention. I mean, we also had an attention manipulation, but we shifted the attention towards the stimulus, which would be um, more natural in a vipassana type meditation. Plus, we explicitly instructed the the non-judgmental aspects of mindfulness. What would be interesting to is to have both conditions in one study actually,
Yeah, yeah, yes, very, yeah.
because in terms of causality, um, so Fadel in his study he compared a resting state with 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 a meditative state, and we did the same. So both studies basically allow to make causal judgments because the experimental condition was manipulated.
Yeah, for folks listening, it's not. This is not a disparagement of Fadel's study. He was studying something differently. It's
Oh
nothing
yes,
against his study.
definitely. I mean, Fadel is a friend of mine, and his study is really great, and it's a really cool part of his study that definitely has to be acknowledged. Is that it is a longitudinal study. I mean, he really showed that that people who have never meditated before can learn how to meditate in just basically 80 minutes, and that it has effect on their pain perception. And that is pretty cool.
Now, so tell us, one of the things I wanted to ask about is self-reporting. And again, this ties into reasons many people tend to dismiss some of these studies. And that's often one of the reasons they use, oh, this is just self-reporting. One of the things I did notice in the paper itself is that it did discuss that briefly and said that though that might be the case, what you were seeing is that the scan results of what was going on in the brain correlated to what that self-reporting is. Could you talk about that for a little bit?
Yes, sure. I mean, one critique that you often get with pain studies, since there is no objective measure of pain.
Pain It's not X units of pain.
Exactly. I mean, it's a subjective experience.
Right.
So you just have to believe whatever the participants tell you. But the results that we saw, I think, cannot be explained only by a self-report bias, because we saw differences in the brain as well. And the differences in pain unpleasantness correlated with brain activation in the posterior insula. So there's even a direct relationship between those.
So I noticed in some of the things that were done in terms of the rigor of the controls, I saw that 3 different individuals were excluded from the analysis of the result due to just what I would consider very minor head motion of 3 millimeters or more. I wanted to ask, in seeing that kind of rigor around what you were doing, if there could be a study perhaps in the future, and maybe this is one that will lead to that, or maybe it was done in this, is a blinding of the results such that the test participants are essentially given a random identification, and that a third party, not knowing which group they were in, would sort them according to what they were responding to and what they were seeing in the brain. I'm wondering if that sort of thing could be done.
I mean, it definitely can be done, and I think some NIH studies even require that. I mean, yes, that is definitely the way to go. But with a relatively small PhD project, and only having funding for one person to work on, or not even having enough funding for that one person.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes, we do need to increase our scholastic funding. Just a note for anybody who's rich who's listening.
Yes.
It's a great place to send your money, is scholastic research. So tell us about the findings. What showed up when you took a look at the brain scans?
So what we found, while meditators were in a state of mindfulness and received the electric shocks, they had increased activation in the posterior insula and decreased activation in the lateral prefrontal cortex as compared to when they received shocks in a baseline condition, so in a normal everyday life condition. And should I go ahead and interpret that? Or actually, I have done it already a little bit. I mean that's basically really the main finding.
Now, was there? I think in the study there were some notes of percentages of control over the pain modulation.
Oh yes, that's right. Actually, I jumped right into the imaging findings. But yes, there was a behavioral side to the study, which is quite important. So what we saw that meditators, in meditators and in controls, there was no change in pain intensity when they meditated as compared to the baseline condition. But in the meditators, we saw a decrease in pain unpleasantness of 22%. And we did not see any change in the controls.
So there was a distinction between the intensity of the pain that's reported. Everyone reported it, whether they were in controls or a meditator. They said,
No,
this is the level of intensity.
yes, but there was no change in pain intensity.
Yeah. Okay. So that was all the same, but their response to it was different. They said the intensity was the same, but you were saying that something else that the meditator's reporting was
Mm-hmm.
less than it was for the control. So there's a distinction between those two then.
Exactly. And that is what has been and actually this distinction, um, no change in pain intensity during a state of mindfulness, but a reduction in pain unpleasantness in a state of mindfulness has been reported before by Fadel, not in his 2011 study, but in an earlier study, if I'm not wrong. And David Perlman has shown the same actually in Tibetan monks.
Mm-hmm. And for those who are experienced meditators listening to the podcast, I expect that many of you have been in a situation where you've been on, say, a retreat, and you've been sitting in the same position for quite some time, and there is some unpleasantness. We would consider it unpleasantness in the body, a pain in your legs or something like that. And the way we often describe this is we change our relationship to the pain. And many of us have had that experience where that sensation is every bit as intense as it is when we're considering it as a suffering from the pain, and when we reinterpret how we're relating to it so that, yes, it's still as intense, but I'm not suffering as much. My report of the unpleasantness is greatly reduced. And it seems that this is what it's showing is, here's a study which indicates what's going on in your brain that's happening. It's not just us making something up. There are actually biological components to that.
Exactly. I totally agree. And actually, I really like your description because I think many people or many meditators will indeed recognize that, that the intensity does not change, but it's, yeah, the unpleasantness.
So now, what are some of the implications of these findings, and what was most interesting to you about this in the results of the study?
Actually, what I found really interesting is to see that we indeed found the neural correlates of this, that we found increased activation in sensory areas, indicating increased sensory processing, which might be related to focusing the attention, like paying more attention to the sensory aspects um, of the stimulus and having less evaluation, less appraising or reappraising, as indicated by the decreased activation in the lateral prefrontal cortex. And I think implications that this could have. I mean, so this study is indicating that there is a different way of pain modulation, a different way, or a way that is different than placebo. It's different than reappraisal. It's different than distraction, and it's relying on different brain mechanisms. And by further studying these underlying mechanisms and how we can optimize or differently um, induce these states, this might be helpful for for people to have reduced suffering, and maybe this is also applicable for chronic pain patients, even though acute pain and chronic pain have different mechanisms. So this is really something that has to be figured out in another study.
Yeah, that was the exciting thing to me when I read the results of the study, and you said it right here, is that because we're not at a point yet where we can, put on a little electrode and push a button and that we've taken care of replicating what we were seeing in this study. We don't have a way to do that yet. In the meantime, what for me was very exciting to see is that for those who do suffer from pain, whether it's a chronic pain of an ongoing illness or whatever, that we have a choice, that we ourselves have the ability to modify how that makes us suffer and the degree to which that makes us suffer, that we don't need to wait for the magic pill that takes care of all our ills. It's something that we can do ourselves. And to me, that was very empowering as someone who does, as all of us do occasionally, have various physical hurts, that this can help us. And it's not something that's in any hands but our own. That was very exciting to see.
Yeah, nicely put. I really like the way you worded it, and I totally agree. It is really empowering, but we still have to see if it is empowering for chronic pain patients, or actually, it's not completely true. I mean, it has been shown, like the first studies of John Kabat-Zinn actually, with mindfulness-based stress reduction, were with chronic pain patients, and immediately after the intervention, there were reduced pain ratings, and even at a 4-year follow-up point, there were no changes in pain ratings, but there were still improvements in psychological health and I think in physical activity. So mindfulness works for chronic pain patients, but we don't know if the mechanisms are the same as this study revealed.
Yeah, that was another fascinating aspect to this, is that there were different mechanisms biologically in place to basically handle pain, whether a distraction kind of technique will give different results than a mindfulness-based technique. To me, it was interesting to see that there are different ways to do it. I would have thought that, yeah, they all just shut down this part of the brain or they light up this other one. Nope, different things happen depending on what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's what I found really fascinating, and it would be very nice to compare these other strategies, distraction and placebo, with meditation in one study.
Mm-hmm.
That'd be really exciting to see, actually.
Yeah, and certainly we've got the right people involved here, and it's nice that you and I are speaking based on a reference from one of your colleagues that was interviewed here, and I'm finding that it's a really very helpful community of dedicated researchers trying to understand what these biological components are in order to help people. Moving forward, what does this indicate for clinical applications? How can we help people? So I thank you very much for doing the work that you're doing, and I'd like to ask if there are any studies you're working on now or that you would like to do that you can share with us, because I understand that often there are studies you're working on you can't talk about, but what could you tell us of the things you might be working on?
Actually, we will start looking in chronic pain patients now, how mindfulness intervention changes the brain, basically. So that's what I can say about it. And hopefully we will start collecting data soon for this project.
Excellent. I look forward to hearing about it. For those who are listening to the podcast, we've been speaking with Tim Gard of Massachusetts General Hospital's Division of Psychiatric Neuroscience at the Lazar Lab. Tim, thank you so much for being here. This has been fascinating.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at www.secularbuddhistassociation.com, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaisa Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.